Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting budgies. Quite a few of you requested for me to paint birds, so I decided to paint this colorful bunch. Like usual, I started by drawing them out. Firstly, I want to establish their position, so I drew out a long branch that they're going to perch on. I want 4 birds to be in this composition, and since I'm drawing on a double page spread, I'm going to draw the ones closest to the halfway point of the spread. Birds are a bit easier to draw straight on, so I'm just starting out with that. Something like an unfinished circle for the head and a longer shape for the body. For the head, I'm just going to draw the face slightly angled so the bird doesn't look too stiff. So the first thing that I did was place the beak first, establish the midpoint, and then added the eyes. Because the body is quite short, this means that the bird is sitting lower on the branch, so I just tried to continue the bottom of the bird from where the body finished off, then I added the tail. I like to vary the position of the birds very slightly, so for this next one, I'm just drawing one which is facing the first bird. You can angle the body a bit more if you want more of an angled position, but it is much easier to draw subtle tilts and angles, so for this one, I just used the same method, but sort of like the opposite direction. And I'm not sure if you've noticed, but when I draw the face, there's a point where the forehead of the bird slightly protrudes out, and this makes it easier to place the facial features like the beak and the eyes. Also, on top of the beak, I just simplified the sear with 2 ovals, and I think that this feature should help position the beak a little bit better. When I'm drawing the outline of the birds, I try to do dashed lines instead of full clean lines because I feel like this helped me to focus on adding more texture throughout the uneven lines as I paint later, and this way the pencil marks will also be hidden behind the paint a bit better. Animal shapes is a bit hard for me to describe, so I'm just trying my best here, but hopefully the visuals will also help with the things that I can't explain very well. I'll also have this outline available in my coffee shop, so if you can't be bothered drawing your own, you can also trace from the outline and get right to painting. I will also leave the reference photos that I used for this painting, even though I didn't really use one in particular. I used a whole bunch of them just as a mood board, so hopefully that will also aid you in painting this. For this last one, I made a more angled position. I made the head pretty much the same way as the others, but as for the body, I made one side a bit more diagonal instead of rounded, so I can connect it to the wing and the tail. For the feet, I'm just going to try to simplify them as much as I can. They're all going to look the same except for the one on the left, which is a bit more angled, but for the other budgies, I just like to make the outer toe, is that what you call it, a bit longer than the ones on the inside, and I just positioned them according to how the birds are placed on the branch. So that's pretty much it for the outline, and before we start to paint, I'm just going to give you the colors that I used for this painting. Firstly, this is Titanium White by Daniel Smith, Hansa Yellow Light by Daniel Smith, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Scarlet Pyrrole by Mgram, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Ultramarine Deep by Holbein, Manganese Blue by Winsor & Newton, Cobalt Teal by Mgram, Olive Green by Holbein, and Graphite Grey by Daniel Smith. So let's get to painting. I'm going to begin by painting random leaves on the branches first. I'm starting with my olive green as the main green, then ultramarine deep to darken the green, and new gamboge to lighten and warm the tone of the green. And I'm just going to separate them on my palette. I like to paint the leaves freehand along the branches. I try to look for empty spaces within the composition where I can add these leaves and alternate between the colors, so when it dries, it doesn't dry with a flat color, but it has an interesting blend of green tones. For some added pop of color, I also decided to add berries, and for these berries, I use Scarlet Pyrrole, and I just use the tip of my brush to paint the very small circles while distributing the positions among the leaves. I'm going to repeat this on areas where I felt like I need to add a little something to balance out the composition, so I'm going to also do the same here on the right hand side. The reason why I'm painting the leaves first is because when I paint the large branch that the budgies are perched on, I can see which areas I'm supposed to leave without layering the leaves on top of the branch color instead, because it won't look as clean that way as watercolors are transparent, and the background color, if I paint that first, would show through the leaves that I paint on top of. So I'm just trying to avoid that, which is why I decided to paint all the leaves first. I'm done with the leaves here, so I'm going to create a brown for the branch. And for that, I used a mixture of graphite gray, new gamboge, and scarlet pyrrole. I'm looking for a ratio which creates this yellowy brown color, but you can also play around with the ratio and customize it to create the tone of brown that you're looking for. If you want something a bit darker, you can add a bit more graphite gray, or if you want it a bit warmer, you can add more of the scarlet pyrrole or even any types of red like quin red maybe. So just feel free to play around with that if you have other preferred tones of brown to include in your composition. As the paint starts to dry off, I like to add another layer using the exact same color mixture. I try to paint thin strokes when I'm applying the color on the branch to suggest the uneven texture. Using the same green mixture, I decided to add another layer of the leaves as well because my paint was quite watery at the start and the color turned out a bit too faded, which is normal, but I'm just going to use this green again to paint half of the leaf so it looks like there's a slight angled fold to them because one side is a bit darker than the other. I'm also going to layer the color of the berries using the same scarlet pyrrole, and you can just paint the whole thing on top, but sometimes I like to also leave out a little bit of the base color so it looks like a bit of a highlight. For the first bird, I want this one to be a bit more colorful and fun, so I decided to use 3 colors for the body. I started out with manganese blue as the main color, and while I'm painting the tummy, I want to leave out a little bit of white space so I can change the color while the manganese blue is still wet. I'm continuing the color with the Hansa Yellow Light, and I'm going to also use the Ultramarine Deep in some areas, but I'm going to use the Ultramarine Deep very sparingly because I want the color to be very bright and cheerful for this one. For the wing and the head, I want to use the Hansa Yellow Light, and I'm just starting out with a medium consistency for the bottom of the wing, then continue on spreading the pigment with just water so I can create a very light yellow. Then for the tail, I'm going to treat it the same way as the tummy by alternating between the 3 colors, but notice that I left out a bit of white line so I can separate the gradients between the sections of the tail so it doesn't blend together into one flat silhouette. As I'm placing the separate colors, I'm not really going to mix the colors together because I want them to blend naturally as they're wet. But if some of the colors are traveling to places you don't want them to, if your paint load was a bit too wet and heavy, you can always pick up the excess using a dry brush. For the beak and the feet, I'm just going to use a mix of titanium white, Hansa Yellow, and scarlet pyrrole to create a light yellow-orange. And as for the cere or the nose, I'm just going to use manganese blue by itself, but you can also use any other colors as they usually differ from bird to bird. Here I'm just layering on more paint on some of the areas which are a bit too light or faded for my liking. And I also like to enhance those layers on the tail, so I used more of the Ultramarine Deep underneath the layers to suggest a bit of shadow. For the second bird, I'm going to keep this one nice and simple. I'm just going to use Ultramarine Deep as the main color and keep the head mostly white with their iconic pattern. I started out by painting the tummy using a very thin consistency Ultramarine Deep, then I used a thick consistency to paint it and dot it around in places, especially at the bottom area where there should be a bit of shadow. For the head, I used a little bit of graphite gray with Ultramarine Deep in a very thin consistency, and this is just to place the indication of where I want to place the pattern later on. As for the tail, I want the color to pop out more, so I added graphite gray with ultramarine deep and a very thick consistency. For the beak and the feet, I ended up adding a little bit of the ultramarine deep that was left on my brush, and I actually quite prefer this color for the feet, especially because it's not too bright and it looks a bit more natural this way. As for the ear or the nose, because the bird is mostly ultramarine deep, I just used ultramarine deep in a light consistency. Since I've painted most of the bird, I'm just going to leave that one to dry for now and move on to the next one. For this next one, I'm going to paint another simple one. I'm going to use yellow as my main color, so this is Hansa Yellow Light. And I'm going to leave the chest of this bird white because I want to add cobalt teal to the chest area. At the top here, I added a little bit of ultramarine deep, but I decided I want the cobalt teal to be a bit stronger. Notice that I am using a fairly thin consistency of the yellow and the cobalt teal, because this way I still have space to layer on more colors. To add a bit of form to the face, I added a little bit of the Scarlet Pyrrole onto the Hansa Yellow Light, and this way you can create a bit of shadow so it doesn't look too flat. As for the beak, I used the same color as before, which is Scarlet Pyrrole, Hansa Yellow Light with titanium white, and a little touch of ultramarine deep. As for the feet, I used the same color mixture but with a bit more ultramarine deep in the ratio. And as for the feet of all of the birds, I'm just going to keep it that exact same color mixture. Moving on to the last bird, I'm going to treat this one like the second bird, but I want the main color to be the cobalt teal instead of the ultramarine deep. I'm just using a thin consistency for the base color and then adding a thicker consistency for the shadow areas, and I want the tail to also be a bit darker. And to add those darker colors, I use a mixture of ultramarine deep and graphite gray on top of the cobalt teal. I'm also going to place the same color mixture underneath the wing for a little bit of shadow. For the head, where the pattern is going to be, I added a very thin consistency of graphite gray into the cobalt teal, and I'm also going to color the wing with the same mixture. Switching to my smaller brush now, I'm going to add the details and patterns using, firstly, a medium consistency of ultramarine deep with graphite gray. And I'm just going to map out those areas first on the face as well as that small part of the wing which is showing. Then I'm going to go over some of the areas of the pattern again using a thicker consistency of the exact same mixture to give more form to the face. For the neck, I used a thick consistency of the exact same mixture but with more graphite gray in the ratio just for that added pop of color. Then for the eyes, I used a thick consistency of graphite gray, which is almost black. As for the feet, I used the brown mixture from the branch with added graphite gray, and I just added thin lines to separate the feet from the branch. Now for the first bird, I'm going to add the same patterns and details, but because the base color is this really nice light yellow, I used my Hansa Yellow Light with graphite gray. I want the pattern on the head to be lighter, so I used around 50-50 ratio of yellow to graphite gray in a fairly thin consistency, but as for the wings, I added more graphite gray in the ratio because I do want it a bit darker. But when I'm painting, I still like to start with a lighter consistency. This way I can layer on specific areas where I want to darken the details further. You might notice that I like to darken this part of the head just like what I did with the ultramarine bird. This is because that section is what I mentioned earlier, being the forehead of the bird, which protrudes out slightly, and this is what will give the extra form to the head. For this yellow bird, I'm going to keep this one plain without any pattern. So I'm just going to treat it the same way as the others, except for the pattern, by painting the shadows on the bottom of the ear, the beak, feet, and forehead. And I'm also going to paint the eyes using graphite gray. Onto the last bird. This is basically the same as the ultramarine deep, but because the base color is cobalt teal this time, I'm going to add graphite gray with the cobalt teal to paint the pattern on the head and the wings. You should be able to see the pattern by now, so if you choose to paint your birds with any different colors than what I'm doing, I would suggest to use that main color still in your color mixture with graphite gray, so the gray still has that bit of hue and does not look too dull and muted against the bright colors of the bird. And of course, for the rest of the bird, I'm going to treat the details of the form, shadows, and facial features the exact same way as what I did to the previous ones. Now that all the elements and details have been painted, I'm going to go over the whole painting again to look for areas where I feel I need to add a bit more saturation or something to be a bit more defined, like the tummy of this bird, which is a bit too light. But yeah, this is basically the time to tie the whole painting together. I've mentioned earlier about layering the pattern. This is so I can define certain patterns further, and it'll give a really nice pop of detail to your final painting. So I'm also going to do this for the rest of the birds with patterns. As for the branch and the leaves, of course, I'm going to add details for those also. I'm just adding a darker brown for the bottom of the branch. But as you keep layering on details on certain parts of the painting, you will see that you will need to balance out the rest of the painting as you build on the layers. So just trust your instinct with this one. Once I'm fairly happy with how the birds are looking, of course, I'm going to add splatters. For the teal bird, I added teal splatters. For the ultramarine bird, I added ultramarine deep splatters. And as for the ones in between, I used Hansa Yellow Light. It's okay if you feel like you're not done yet, because this is just a process of layering. So I'm going to go back to the birds again and add further details until I'm fairly happy with the amount of contrast and details, which I try to keep fairly simple anyway because I am treating this fairly loosely. Lastly, for the final step, I'm going to use my white jelly roll pen to add highlights for the eyes, beaks, texture for the feet of the birds, and also highlights on the berries. And this is the finished painting. I really had fun playing with the color combinations for this one. Like usual, the list of tools that I use in this video, as well as my social media links, will be in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!